Welcome back, folks. I'm Frizz, and today I'd like to take some time to talk about something absolutely riveting: the materials that weapons and armor are made out of. Exciting stuff, I know. Most of the time, the materials that make up people's weapons aren't actually important mechanically, and that's perfectly fine. Tracking the minute details of weapons constructions and the differences between having a sword made out of bronze and one made out of steel really isn't that important in a game like Pathfinder, and I'm happy that the baseline expectation for gear is really simple. However, there are actual materials that give special properties to weapons and armor, and while I like the system overall, I have some thoughts. Generally speaking, using a special material to make a piece of gear comes with niche uses when it's used against specific types of enemies. Having a silver sword isn't going to be any more useful than any other pointy bit of metal when you're fighting a normal person, but it's going to be really helpful if you're fighting a werewolf. There are two main ways that special materials interact with creatures, and generally everything is actually on the creature's stat block rather than being a special function of the item. The first of these is that some creatures have weaknesses to attacks made with certain weapons. As an example, basically every Fey creature has a weakness to cold iron weapons, meaning that having a cold iron weapon is going to make your life dramatically easier if you know that you're going to be fighting a bunch of Fey or demons sometime soon. The other common interaction with special materials is that a lot of creatures have resistance to all physical damage that is not done by that type of material. Now, this is actually a little bit more impactful in my opinion when compared to something just having a weakness, because if you are able to exploit a weakness, it's a nice bonus on top of your normal damage. But being able to bypass damage resistance is absolutely huge, especially if you're not a particularly high-strength character. Like, it changes the entire feeling of the fight. Don't get me wrong, it's always nice to be able to exploit weaknesses, but getting around damage resistance feels a lot more impactful. Again, especially if you don't hit super hard because you're not like a barbarian with a great sword. So obviously, these are good reasons to have your weapon be made out of different materials. However, my first complaint about special materials is very simple. They are really niche. Outside of fighting a creature with a special reaction to silver, there's basically nothing different about a silver weapon, and that's actually fine with silver, since it's pretty low level and cheap, but like adamantine is dramatically more expensive, but its predominant use is similar of bypassing, different resistances. Basically, special materials are super niche upgrades that, while they are really good when they are relevant, they're incredibly underwhelming or even useless depending on what you're fighting, and you're not really going to have much control over, ensuring that you're fighting enemies where that type of weapon or armor is actually useful. Of course, a lot of special materials do actually come with special mechanics. Sadly, these are often very underwhelming. For example, an adamantine weapon treats an object's hardness as half of what it normally is when you're calculating damage, but only so long as the hardness of that object is below your weapon's hardness. This has some uses, but it just, isn't interesting. That's the general trend across all of the special materials that Paizer's released. They have some fun, interesting niche uses, but ultimately they're just so niche. The main reason why being so hyper-specialized is kind of bad is that you can't exactly have tons of spare weapons or suits of armor lying around. Switching between different armor sets is impossible in combat, basically, and it costs a lot of gold to get all the necessary runes to keep gear relevant. And that makes just, picking up some gear made out of some special, extremely expensive piece of, metal really prohibitively expensive. Unless it's going to be your main weapon or your main set of armor. Because you need runes to keep stuff up to speed, it's not very attractive to just keep around a spare silver or cold iron weapon just in case you might end up needing it, because it's going to be missing out on all of the other runes, which, if it doesn't have all of the runes, it might well just be better to use your normal weapon instead of changing up what you're using based on what you're fighting. Just as a quick aside, my other complaint about special materials is that Paizo has basically just catered to martial characters so far. I mean, yeah, it's obvious that stuff that makes weapons and armor more interesting is going to predominantly be important to people who use weapons and armor. But there's a lot of unexploited possibilities here for spellcasters. Like, what about a special type of wood or metal that makes particularly interesting stabs, or some cloth that responds weirdly to magic that makes robes made out of it have special properties? There's a lot of fun possibilities there, and I don't want the system to just purely be useful for martial characters. Ultimately, I'd like to see some special materials that truly feel like they fill the role of a permanent upgrade that's broadly useful, rather than a super niche upgrade that a lot of the time might feel like a little bit of a waste of gold. Like, a flaming rune is a fantastic upgrade to your main weapon that increases your damage dealt across basically every single encounter. While not expecting a direct damage increase quite like that from special materials, I don't think that having a super dense alloy that gives your weapon the shove trait or a bonus on checks to shove would be beyond reason to ask for. Special materials already have their own use cases, but I'd like to see some uses that are broadly useful rather than being hyper specific. Thanks for watching. I've had a bit of trouble coming up with video topics recently, but I'm hoping to get back on track with my schedule soon. Well, what do you think about special materials? Let me know in a comment down below, and while you're down there, you can always consider subscribing to the channel or joining the channel as a member. My members are wonderfully supportive, and I appreciate them all a lot. Regardless, until I see you next, live a wonderful life.